a constant but manageable threat. That's how Russia was described in the new U.S. National Defense Strategy published by the Pentagon. Meanwhile, in Moscow, officials remain puzzled as to why no progress has been made in negotiations with Washington on the return of diplomatic property and the resumption of direct air travel. Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia Sergei Ryabkov called these, and I quote, irritants in bilateral relations. And this is precisely where the main paradox of the new reality emerges. While the White House continues to consistently contain the Russian Federation both politically and economically, the Kremlin still hopes to befriend the United States. How has this new format of bilateral relations taken shape? Let's break it down now. Donald Trump is Putin's new rival in the fight for unlimited power. That's the headline of an article published in the New York Times. The authors note that while the Kremlin previously tried to push its interests almost single-handedly, using force and ignoring international law, now the new American administration is shifting the balance of power. And if Moscow tries to resist this using its usual methods, the consequences for it could be disastrous.
For many years, Putin has gained a geopolitical advantage by aggressively showcasing Russia's power in world affairs. Break time equals 0.5s/ and taking significant risks in military and intelligence spheres. An American president who acts in the same way benefits Putin. Break time equals 0.5s/ as long as they see eye to eye, but otherwise threatens to limit his influence. Break time equals 0.5s/ since Washington's global military and economic power significantly surpasses that of Russia. From a publication by the New York Times.
Security experts like Mark Galati believe that at one time, Putin saw opportunities in the chaotic actions of Trump. Back then, the U.S. president was often described as a politician who was friendly toward Moscow. However, even within Russia, not everyone shared this point of view. For example, retired General Andrei Kartapolov, who now heads the State Duma Defense Committee, stated outright, "Trump is not our friend." And judging by recent events, this assessment turned out to be much closer to reality. Today, the Kremlin is increasingly aware that the interests of the American leader and those of the Russian Federation do not align.
It's still quite uncertain what, if anything at all, will eventually come of the diplomatic negotiations between Russia, the United States, and Ukraine held in the UAE, but to some significant extent, Moscow felt compelled to hold them. We had originally hoped to secure some firm commitments on territorial concessions first, one Russian foreign policy expert admitted to me, but in the end, we just had to go along with the Americans. Mark Gigliotti, columnist, in a column for the Sunday Times.
However, Donald Trump has never really hidden his intentions regarding Russia, and there are plenty of examples of that. Let's start with the events in Syria in 2024. Against the backdrop of opposition forces coming to power and the collapse of Bashar al-Assad's regime, a longtime ally of Putin, Washington took one of the key positions in working with the new leadership in Damascus, while Moscow failed to secure the right to keep its military bases. And thus, in essence, Moscow completely lost its influence in the country. All it got was the fugitive Assad and his family. Next comes 2025 and the airstrike on Iran, the Kremlin's key ally in the Middle East. Moscow's response was zero. Washington interpreted this signal unambiguously, and so the Donald Trump administration decisively moved on to the next step and got rid of another friend of the Russian dictator, Nicolas Maduro.
Trump's audacity effectively deprived Putin of his main competitive advantage, the image of the world's top gangster. Putin's revanchist attack on the post-Cold War security system depended heavily not so much on Russia's military or economic power, but rather on his firm confidence that the West was in decline and that America was intent on preserving the existing status quo. From a publication in The Economist.
So what do we see? Russia has been steadily losing influence, first in the Middle East, and then in Latin America. In Central Asia and the South Caucasus, by the way, Russia's traditionally strong positions have also been seriously undermined after Azerbaijan and Armenia signed a peace agreement at the White House. However, there is still one region where Moscow is still trying to maintain its status, while Washington is trying to change the balance of power. We're talking about the Arctic. The U.S. president wants to deploy elements of the American missile defense system, the Golden Dome, there. It could serve as an additional tool for deterrence. and, if necessary, allow for the interception of Russian missiles even as they approach North America. In addition, it's important to remember that the Russian fleet is also present in the region, and Ukraine is ready to provide support in countering this threat, President Volodymyr Zelensky stated.
We know what to do if Russian warships are freely sailing around Greenland. Ukraine can help. We have the expertise and the weapons to make sure not a single ship remains. They can sink off Greenland just like they sink off Crimea. No problem. We have the tools, we have the people. For us, the sea is not the first line of defense, and we know exactly how to act, he said.
One might think, what could be more humiliating for Russia than its inability to protect its allies and the subsequent loss of influence in key regions? However, as it turns out, there is an answer. It is the seizure of Russian oil tankers by the US and silence in response. Formally, Moscow did respond. The Russian side asked Washington to return the Russian citizens, the crew members. But that was basically the end of it, since the United States has yet to grant this request. Moreover, the oil from 7 seized ships of the Shadow Fleet was confiscated. Donald Trump openly stated this in an interview with the New York Post. And after the US, a tanker from the Russian Shadow Fleet was detained by France with the support of the United Kingdom. The Kremlin was clearly not prepared for this turn of events. And while they prefer to avoid public comments for now, Russian propagandists are filling the information gap.
If the pace continues, by spring the Shadow Fleet might just come to a halt. Then the choice becomes very simple, either a deal on Washington's terms or a collapse of budget revenues, Russian propagandists are quoted by the media as saying.
And after all these painful steps from Moscow, Putin suddenly offers money to Washington. This is about Russia joining Donald Trump's Council of Peace. According to the Russian dictator, Moscow is already ready to transfer $1 billion from its frozen assets in the US. That is, funds he never really expected to get back anyway. The exact amount of Russian assets blocked in the United States is unknown, but most often the figure mentioned is around $5 billion. And it's important to note here, the point is that the Kremlin simply has no room left to maneuver.
Although Putin most likely perceives this invitation as an offer he can't refuse, that doesn't mean he's entirely happy with this newly formed club. These insights were noted by Mark Galeotti, a columnist in a piece for the Sunday Times.
The point is that in the Council of Peace, where Donald Trump has become the lifelong chairman and most of the executive committee members are Americans, Russia will be just an ordinary participant. And for a country that, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, has gotten used to freely abusing its veto power, this is a significant downgrade in status. Yet, this pales beside the blow to the aggressor's reputation from the war against Ukraine. In nearly 4 years since Russia's full-scale invasion, it has failed to occupy Ukraine and hasn't reached the administrative borders of the Donetsk region. The only way for Moscow to avoid escalating tensions with Washington remains negotiations about possible formats for a ceasefire and the terms of a peaceful settlement. On January 24th and 25th, trilateral negotiations between the US, Ukraine, and Russia took place in Abu Dhabi. There has been some progress, according to the parties, but the key issue remains unresolved, the territorial question. As a result, Moscow faces the same question: how to achieve its stated goals without entering into a direct conflict with the United States, whose favor the Kremlin is so eager to win. And Putin's position in this configuration is unenviable.